We're so very grateful for you listening and joining us on No Small Endeavor. In 2024, NSC reached some exciting milestones. This year, we moved from being in the top 10% of podcasts to the top 1% of all podcasts, while being aired on more than 40 public radio stations around the country. And thanks to many of you voting for us, we received our first Prominent Industry Award, a Silver Signal Award. I like to think that these achievements reflect our continued commitment to our mission. This work only matters if it contributes to your life and to the shared life of our cities, families, and communities. And it only matters when you are a part of the mix. So, we thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank our outstanding production, management, and marketing team, because we most definitely could not do NSC without them. They do such a stellar job, and I'm super proud to work with all of them. Christy, Jacob, Sophie, Tom, Kate, Mary Evelyn, Carriad, Jason, Audrey, and Tim. To sustain and expand this work, we're turning to you. Specifically, we're asking you to become an NSC Plus subscriber, because we depend upon such revenue to make NSC possible. You can choose the monthly amount, starting as low as $5 per month. Consider making it $10, $20, maybe even $100 per month. In exchange, you get lots of perks like ad-free listening, exclusive content available only to NSC Plus members, and pre-sale access to tickets for live events. And you'll get a sense of contribution knowing you are helping sustain work that's seeking to sow beauty, truth, and goodness into the world. So if you will, please go to our website, nosmallendeavor.com, and click Join NSC Plus. Many thanks.
Why do people commit themselves to the things they do? Why are people so worried about sport? Why wine? Why video games? I'm Brian Lowry, and in this season of my podcast, Know What You See, I'm asking a simple question, but a really big one. What's the point? In conversations with people with a variety of passions and obsessions, we get the chance to look through a window and see what it means to truly focus on a realm of human experience. Join me on Know What You See. New episodes begin November 26th.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
We have to change the metaphor of our culture. It is not a battleground to fight over. It is an ecosystem to steward, a garden to take care of.
That's Makoto Fujimura, an abstract expressionist artist who finds himself continually attempting to bridge a divide between art and faith.
I can't really talk about my faith and, with my artist friends, and I can't talk about art with my Christian friends because they, both sides divided the two, right? But for me, it's never been that way.
All coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Probably a decade ago, I had the opportunity to conduct a brief interview with the celebrated artist Makoto Fujimura on a live show we produced here in Nashville. Mako merges abstract expressionism with traditional Japanese techniques. He's a former presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts and received an award from the American Academy of Religion for his contributions to bridging art and faith. Since that time of our first meeting, I've been looking for an opportunity to connect with him again. So on a recent visit to New York City, we arranged to meet at Mako's gallery. I had some extra time that afternoon, wanted to spend some time with some of Mako's work before the interview. So I made my way via train and bus across the Hudson River to Fort Lee, New Jersey, and made my way to the gallery. In the center was a long room filled with floor-to-ceiling abstract paintings. I found myself drawn to one particular piece, a striking piece, mostly gold. I pulled a chair to the middle of the room, sat down about 8 feet from the painting, and began gazing, refusing to allow myself to pay attention to time or to glance at my watch. And after some time, I found myself pulling the chair towards the painting, and when I sat down again, my face was probably 24 inches from the canvas, and I kept simply staring, meditating, and drawn into it all. The layers and depth began to surprise me. I began to see bold flashes of color that previously I could not see until I had allowed my eyes to adjust given my brain time to recalibrate, I discerned some sort of structure underneath it all. I was transfixed. It was like meditation. The subsequent conversation with Mako was analogical to that experience, a slow, lingering, meditative conversation that continued to reveal more and more depth, new possibilities, even, dare I say, some new brilliance. Here's my conversation with Makoto Fujimura. Mako, thanks for having us.
It's great to have you here.
Here we are in your beautiful gallery, and would you perhaps introduce Nihonga to us?
Nihonga is Japanese painting, directly translated, and it was a term coined in early 20th century, a little earlier than that. In Japan, it was Meiji era, where Western culture was coming in at very rapid pace. And this Harvard professor of art history who loved Japan was teaching in Japan, coined this term to distinguish Japanese paintings from Western paintings, to really try to preserve this ancient way of painting that has been refined over time. And I call it slow art because it is literally creating pigments and mixture of paint yourself. So you control all the elements. Pigments are pulverized by generations of artisans who serve Nihonga in Japan. And so there's an ecosystem of paper makers, silk makers, brush makers, pigment shop owners that I get to be part of that ecosystem to carry on that tradition. But in my case, it's in contemporary art. So I'm bringing that slow art to contemporary art genre.
Now I understand that you may do a great number of layers, and then you have to wait as they dry?
Right. So sometimes over 100 to 150 layers before I start painting an image. And that's part of the meditative quality of what I do, which appeals to me, but it's slow and it's also mutable. The pigments will settle over time. And so some of the works will use silver will tarnish over time. And that's part of the calculation of Nihonga is you're actually capturing time itself. And the slowness of it is also a way to reveal something about qualities of our lives that is captured in the layers of painting.
Now, you say this meditative quality appeals to you. So would you describe for us a bit more, what's the process like for you? In what way is it meditative for you?
Right. So we live in the very fast-paced world with technology and where productivity and efficiency has so become part of the natural rhythm. So we don't really stop anymore. It's like going to A to Z very fast. And there are certainly advantages of that. But I've always found, especially digital technology, to be dehumanizing, or at least it doesn't allow you to capture the full senses of what human beings are capable of getting to know the world through our senses. And so when I encountered Nihonga materials and technique, immediately something clicked in me that recognized that our sensory perceptions have far more capacities than this flat image that we are always creating on digital imagery. Anybody can create images now. So I do the opposite. I kind of make art that you can't really, if you would take, iPhone photo of this, it would completely not work. In some of the images, the layers are done in such a way that I have people try taking a photo of my work, and they're just astonished because what's happening is the refractive element, the prismatic elements of the surface of my work. Your eye can see it and will read it as blue or green or whatever the color may be. But when you use digital technology, the mechanism will take that away. So it looks completely gray. And people are like, how could this be? This is my iPhone. I just got this. And I say, well, digital technology is great for certain things like taking portraits and flowers, but it is not good at finding that in-between gap of perception that we all are capable of seeing. And oftentimes beauty comes through those gaps.
I wanted us to set up here, for those who are just listening and can't see, we're sitting in front of a beautiful piece that's maybe how large?
It'll be about 7 by 12 feet, maybe, something like that.
So when I came into this gallery space, it immediately caught my attention, and this was earlier this afternoon, and I had the place to myself, and I thought, I'm just going to sit. And I found myself in this sort of meditative place where I found myself breathing very deeply. And then it was sitting with it where I began to see all sorts of things that I could not see without sitting with it for quite some time. It was a remarkable experience. And then in a book about your work that was sitting here on this bench later, I read where one commentator said, "The unfinished character of art is an invitation to the viewer to participate in the work itself. One of the goals of the art of Fujimura is to cultivate in viewers the art of remembering. The experience is meditative, if not prayerful." And I found it remarkable that he was describing exactly what I had experienced while I was sitting here. But how do you react to that?
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. I desire for people to slow down themselves, to take in my work, because you don't really see it for a while. And I just did a museum show at Pepperdine University, and there's a beautiful museum there. And the curator kindly posted, "You must commit to sitting in front of one of these paintings, otherwise you will miss it," And I was really thankful. And just to explain what's happening in this piece behind us is a golden piece, which invokes the Rimpa screens of 17th century, using gold. And in many cases, the gold is layered. Japanese gold is the thinnest, microscopically thin, very hard to use. So there's 5 layers of gold right behind me. And then there's pigments underneath, which is very gestural in this case, done on the largest paper at the time that was created in Japan. And in mid-2000, when Willem de Kooning, one of the great giants of abstract expressionism, passed away, I wanted to do a piece in homage of him. And a piece here, my piece is called Charis, and it's Charis is Greek for grace. And I wanted that layering of minerals and the flattening of gilded gold to speak of the mystery of how really, even though gold will flatten the surface, it creates more depth, right? So, but you don't see the depth of it until your eyes adjust and you start to, our minds are trained to categorize things. So when we see a blue painting, we say, "Oh, that's a blue painting. There's nothing there." Or gold painting, there's nothing there. But once you slow down, as you experience, you see the layers, and your eyes actually are already ahead of the mind that continues to shut down perception. So your eyes are basically part of the brain. So if you relax and if you open your eyes, you see miraculous images everywhere, actually. Burning bushes everywhere. But it takes time for most of us. And so your experience of moving from a distance to close is oftentimes the case. People are drawn into the work and they see things like, wait, how could that be? Is it the same painting? Kind of experience. And then they start to really enjoy the work.
So I'm just a good old boy from Alabama. I don't understand high art and abstract expressionism. And so I wonder sometimes, is the experience of a viewer of abstract expressionism, do you think that they're seeing more of themselves, or are they seeing what the artist wants them to see?
Great artists great and enduring because they are able to capture something about what the audience bring in their work. Now, a Rothko painting painted in 1955. The reason why his paintings are so valued today is because the more people see it, the more they are able to bring in generatively through the work. Somehow it becomes a portal. And those of us who have seen it maybe 100 times will continue to find some newness in it. So artists are aware of this, because they are painting toward an audience. Some artists like Mark Rothko would always talk about what he wanted the audience to experience was not his expression. It was a mystery of reality or some kind of a way that the audience can enter into what is really valuable in human experience. And so he was very aware of this. And so many artists, William de Kooning included, would be very much wanting that audience maybe 100 years later. They were anticipating that their work will continue to generate, speak meaning into the time that is not theirs.
About a decade ago, you received a Religion in the Arts Award. And in your speech of receiving that award, you suggested that there's this contemporary schism between faith and art. And you say, even today with such a schism, people hunger for this integration between faith and art. One of the directors of the New York galleries with which I have been associated, who does not share my religious convictions, once said to me, all great art is religious. And then in a video on your work, there's a gallery owner who's commenting about your work, and she says, there's a line in the contemporary art world. You can paint and you can worship, but don't do them together. If you step over that line, you're in essence setting yourself up for crucifixion. So talk to us about this division and how you're trying to refuse to accept that dichotomy.
I grew up very much an agnostic. My father was a scientist, a pure researcher, and my mother an educator. And I didn't know that her parents were leaders in an underground Christian church, but I only discovered that later. So I grew up not really having any kind of religious convictions, or, I didn't go to church. So when I came to faith, it was through reading William Blake. I was in my mid-20s, and I was reading his epic poem, Jerusalem, his last epic poem, some 400 pages long. I waded through this thing because I wanted to ask that question about what is the reality that I am not seeing, which I was convinced existed. William Blake obviously spoke directly about experience of seeing Jesus, and he would describe this encounter as really honest dialogue, asking God about huge questions of humanity. So at the end of Jerusalem, out beyond his emanation or his main symbol of humanity, comes at the foot of the cross. Jesus is there on the cross and says, "O Lord, my selfhood cruel marches against thee, deceitful to meet thee in my pride." And when I read that, I was like, that's it. I understand this. There's something cruel operating inside of me that even though I want to be a good person, I want to work toward at least being able to love others and love myself. But there's something mitigating against that. And so I'll be on looking up at Jesus and saying, what do I do about this? Right? And Jesus answers from the cross says, fear not, unless I die, thou cannot live. But if I die, thou should arise with me. And he asks this question. He says, wouldst thou love one who never died for thee, or ever love one who has not died for thee? It is, in essence, what Jesus did on the cross was to give himself so that he defined what love was. That love is sacrifice. That love will liberate us from that bondage that we find ourselves, being cruel toward others, cruel toward ourselves. And when I read that, I felt something click in me, because since childhood, whenever I'm painting, I experience this flow. I would tell my mom about it. I had this experience of something going through me. I knew it wasn't mine. I knew I didn't own that. I knew it was a gift. I felt in my bones when I was painting this connection flowing through me. And of course, that voice of Jesus that Blake introduced me to is Gospel John. And when I read the Gospel John, I know that that's the voice that I sensed as a child. And it was so distinct. I realized this is it. I have now a name for my experience. And I came to realize, okay, so I can't really talk about my faith and, with my artist friends. And I can't talk about art with my Christian friends because they, both sides divided the two, right? But for me, it's never been that way.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and a conversation with Mako Fujimura. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and full transcript. We would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor, because those reviews help extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Mako Fujimura and I continue to discuss the art and faith divide and what it was like to make art after the terrorist attack of September 11. Hello, friends. An important housekeeping announcement regarding publishing. We currently release our normal edited podcast episodes on Thursdays, the unabridged episodes the following Tuesday, but due to the principalities and powers that be in the podcast industry starting in the new year, we are switching it up. New edited episodes will come out every Monday, and the unabridged version will release Friday of the same week. So start your week with the edited version on Monday, end it with the unabridged on Friday. So new year, new rhythm, same exploration of living a good life. See you on a Monday soon. Kintsugi.
Yes.
Another significant art form for you. Would you unpack that for us a bit?
Right. So Kintsugi form comes out of Urushi tradition, Japan lacquer tradition. And when I was at Tokyo University of the Arts studying Nihonga, I had many friends who were, their major was Urushi, and this is quite amazing. When you enter Urushi discipline as a freshman in this university, you have to go through 6 months of basically immunizing yourself from this poison sumac material. Back then, it was relatively unknown form, but this is tradition of repairing broken ceramics, but to make something more valuable than before it broke, which is to use urushi, which is actually very expensive, and gold. So you may have a noodle bowl from 17th century Korea that was used in high tea in Japan that somehow broke during an earthquake. And families of tea masters will hold on to the fragments for generations sometimes. And then the urushi master will mend it, which means that the bowl originally might have been 10 cents. And you're spending, thousands of dollars to mend this because of the significance of the story behind what this bowl represented and who it served, which I always found fascinating. And when I was doing my research on my book, Silence and Beauty, which is on Shusaku Endo's post-war masterpiece on persecution of Christians in the 17th century, I went back to Japan to do some research, and I encountered kintsugi again there in a context of how Japanese see brokenness as sacred. So when something breaks, you don't throw it away because it has more history because it broke, and how somehow the shapes of the fragments are so unique unto each broken piece that there's a story that you can weave out of that shape. And so kintsugi masters will create rivers and landscapes out of these basically by using gold. And so it's more than just filling the cracks. It's really recreating something. And when I began to understand Christianity, I was really astonished that Jesus post-resurrection appearances, he could have come back as anything. He's God after all. But he chose the human body, first of all, which is incredible to me that he would do that after all that he's been through. But that he also came back as a wounded human being, right? So his nail marks are still with him. And so kintsugi became this theological reality for me as well. And isn't it amazing that Japan, which is so perhaps alien to Christian faith, held on to this idea that brokenness is sacred? Where did that come from? How is that part of Japanese, such a significant part of Japanese culture, to the extent that you may argue that Senna Rikyu, the great tea master, urushi tradition, all of the art forms, the aesthetics of Japan is based on this brokenness as an entry point, imperfection, immaculateness as an entry point into a journey toward the new.
You were commissioned to do a illustrated version of the King James Version. I think it was the 400th anniversary of the King James Version and of the Four Gospels, and which is a spectacularly beautiful work. But I read that you indicated that the single verse, Jesus wept, was one that was with you the whole time that you were doing all of that work.
Yeah. John 11:35, Jesus wept, 2 words, right? Really, even before this commission, which was released in 2011, 400th anniversary of King James, I had been for decades before that. Perhaps in the mid-90s, I began to think this way. But I am literally painting with Jesus' tears. This brokenness of pulverized minerals and nikawa, which is the hide glue that's used in Japan. Mixture is water-based. And so things, tragedies, realities of brokenness and violence really in the world. I think it was heightened by Columbine high school shooting. And I just sensed something deeply, deeply Christ tears upon us. So I began to paint almost invoking that. And then 9/11 happened. I'm a survivor of 9/11. I was trapped under the towers in a subway for 45 minutes. So it's a miracle that I am still here. But after that, I thought just over and over again what those 2 words mean. Jesus wept for my life, but also how to move forward in this time. Do you dare paint in such a time as this? And when I realized that I had the language to deal with my own trauma as well as the collective trauma that we were going through post 9/11. This is the pinhole. Jesus wept. And everything else flows out of that pinhole. And so my art has always been a pursuit process of trying to grasp the vastness of those two words. And I thought I would move on at some point, and I never did.
I mean, it's striking to me that here you were trapped under some of the rubble, under the streets and the subway in 9/11, and then asking yourself the question, does one dare paint at such a time as this? And one could ask that question in a sort of utilitarian fashion, right? Of, dare I paint? And if the answer is yes, then finding some sort of utilitarian end. I'm going to paint because such and so, I'll get to do such and so, or I'll communicate such and so. But what I heard you saying is not a utilitarian answer, but instead saying that you came to see that your work as an artist was itself an embodiment of the grief of God over the world.
That's really a great angle to understand what I was going through, and I'm still going through that in some way. Utilitarian pragmatism, what I see as in the same way that industrial perfectionism has brought in this expectation of something being complete and perfect, is the direction opposite of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, Jesus weeping when Mary was weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. It's a profound reality of why would Son of God weep when he's about to resurrect Lazarus? He had the answer. But he chose to spend that moment not only being human, but being a friend who saw his friend's tears and was angry at that reality. He stopped and he felt deeply the grief of the moment. And so that, when I thought about that, something opened up for me, which is art, which has always been pushed toward utilitarian ends. That you have to have kind of this purpose-driven way of being an artist. If it's not useful, then why do it? And I look at art, I see something different. So I see something that is profoundly important for human beings to understand that our purpose on this earth is not fully utilitarian, although that's certainly part of what we do, but ultimately meaning is given to us by understanding that feeling deeply about reality that is broken, right? And just like the Japanese, saying that ground zero, brokenness in front of us, is sacred. And it is here that we start our journey.
Even the kintsugi, it seems to me that art form acknowledges a sort of usefulness, a sort of utilitarian in the
right.
It's pottery that once had a use.
Yes.
But the beauty is beyond the use, right? It's a sort of, it's broken. Its usefulness is transcended perhaps by a greater beauty, a greater end.
Yeah. It's still useful because you can serve tea. And urushi is very important art form because it is really alive and remains flexible, and it's waterproof, and you can serve tea again. But you're right that it goes way beyond that. If that was the only purpose, then why bother pouring gold on top or designing with the fractures? And these are spectacular designs. Sometimes there's a technique called makie, which uses pearl substance to create design. And I mean, it just goes on and on. So that process reveals something about nature of art And by art, I mean all sorts of art, including cooking and dancing. And all of us are artists in that sense, that we are driven to find that connection and meaning. It's a really interesting inflection point where we deal with, paradoxically, something that doesn't make sense and something that we struggle with, we don't understand. And yet there is a way that somatically, by creating something that is enduring, you tap into that.
So with that sort of attentiveness to the brokenness of the world, you mentioned your own experience on September 11, but I also read that your grandfather was an observer to the horrors of Hiroshima.
Yeah, he was second in command at Education Department. He was sent to Hiroshima 2 weeks after to report to the government.
How do you feel as if that experience of his has informed your sensibilities?
He never talked about it. My mother told me that he could never talk about the experience. But I sense when my mother was alive, I sensed in her the weight of that experience. Trauma being carried through generations and struggles with anxiety and fear of the future. And I think for him, he had very much a moral perspective of, and as I found out later, he was an underground teacher of the Bible. He post-war in this Mukyokai, no church movement, which was basically like a discipleship group that met secretly, sometimes among the intellectual communities of Tokyo. And I think that was his way of addressing the trauma. But my mother, since she did not inherit that faith, at least until the end of her days, I didn't know about any of this until I started to look into the trauma of Japanese history of faith through Shusa Kendo's work, Silence. And as I wrote the book, I showed it to my mother, and she was like, "Oh, this makes sense because your grandfather's, these underground leaders, and you never told me that, Mom." And my mom was like, "You never asked."
You had to write a book to learn these things about your family.
Exactly. Oh, it's mysterious, unveiling.
And here you are, a Japanese American who's Christian, plus your grandfather having been a witness to Hiroshima. It's like, what do you do with all of that?
Wow, you just paint, and perhaps you write about it. But seriously though, painting allows me to, at least in being, accepting the mystery of it that you will never fully comprehend, but somehow intuitively, I can capture all of that, because I think my process of painting, the slow method, allows me to somehow bring in all of what I am struggling with, what I am rejoicing about, what I'm really questioning to God, why, or even the complexity of my own feelings, which is sometimes hard to explain in canvas and paper and silk in front of me. I can somehow express that.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, we'll talk with Mako about how he's trying to bridge the cultural divide between the world of faith and the world of art. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. At one point, you say, I don't remember the context for this, but you indicated that at times atheists seem to understand what you're up to better than theists. Why is that, you think?
Well, if you are a committed atheist, you have very thoughtful arguments against theism. And because of that, it's some kind of a mirroring of theism. They know what they're denying. I have learned so much by listening to atheists point out things about what they don't believe. I love listening to people with convictions, people who are thoughtful, and the best of them can dwell in the realm of mystery still. And so there in that mystery zone, I am having a fellowship. It doesn't matter what you claim to be. We can stand in front of a Rothko painting together and weep.
You say, to this day, I count it as my privilege to get to know brothers and sisters in communities that many evangelical leaders have labeled as plagues to avoid. You want to unpack that for us just a bit?
And there's so much today, especially divide in culture, demonizing the other side as this and that, and they come to threaten us. And perhaps that's the experience. Because I'm an artist, I dwell in the margins and I get to hear voices of those who, even very early on in my journey, articulating things that are very true and authentic, and that the credibility of their experience is just as valuable as anybody else. And when you see someone who has been traumatized by the church, grew up in the South, many artists grew up in areas where they grew up in the church. And we have these conversations, and they are very much anti-Christian sentiment because of what they experienced. And when we begin to uncover what that is, I would be an atheist if I went through that. I'm so sorry, And so in many cases, we label the other, and it happens from their side too, So, we may criticize conservatives for this and that, and we have set notions of what, those people stand for, and I can't believe, and I bring, in some cases, I literally will intentionally bring my conservative friends with my artist friends and just have a dinner, and at the end of the time, you end up with, oh, I didn't know that about what you believe, or thank you for sharing your heart, because I can think of so many ways where my relationship with this other person or my upbringing has led me to believe in this entrenched view where perhaps I was wrong.
You've framed some of your work as culture care, and you have spoken of culture care as a non-violent resistance against culture wars, which is a fascinating, provocative way to put it, I think. So would you unpack that some for us?
Right. Culture wars, a term that sociologist James Davison Hunter coined, I believe, as early as 80s. He was talking about these, and he wrote a book called Culture Wars, and he's a friend of mine and tells me that he never expected that word to become a culture itself. But here we are. And actually in his book, he predicted that the polarization and demonization of these two sides of political spectrum would end up being paralyzed. And people take advantage of that, that gap. And we would end up defending things that we never thought we would be defending. Well, that's exactly what's happening. We have to change the metaphor about culture. It is not a battleground to fight over. It is a ecosystem to steward, a garden to take care of. Mm. If you have a garden, a patch of land that you share, let's say a public garden, you don't really care what the person's political views are. You care that the person has great tomatoes. you want to learn from that person, right? And that's culture. Culture is about fruitfulness. And so we have twisted and convinced ourselves that culture is dangerous, first of all. So we have to defend our turf, and we have to get guns and whatever we need to protect it. But if it's a soil to tend to, and so that when you plant seeds, that it will take root and grow, that it's a generative source that all of us need to feed upon that abundance, then it's a different mindset. You can disagree with your neighbor about that, but you care most about the fruit. Artists who tend to be conscripted into the front lines of culture wars have expressed to me that that's not what they're interested in at all, right? They want to play music. They want to create fruit. But we've been treating them as soldiers rather than gardeners. And they're struggling because of that. So this also, by the way, happens in churches, right? So many artists who, are part of a church tradition, they feel exiled from that very culture that sees culture as a battleground.
That leads us beautifully to a last question. You say at one point, art is always transgressive, and we need to transgress in love. And then you go on to say, we today have a language that celebrates waywardness, but we do not have a cultural language to bring people back home. Everything I do has something to do with that.
Yeah, so we often associate transgression as something that is associated with sinfulness, especially in religious communities. And obviously, I'm not talking about sinning more, but transgression in terms of crossing the boundary and willingness to take risks and establish conventional norm, when the established conventional norm is this polarized, divisive cultural war schism, when the ceramic vessel is broken and the kintsugi master looks at the brokenness and in a sense brings that to a realm of aesthetic value, that person is transgressing against the normative reality of a ceramic bowl. And in that sense, what artists can do and what we have been taught or trained to do is to see beyond the survival mode, mechanism that in our education system, we train everybody to simply put blinders on and see what is in front of you and solve that problem. And what artists have learned to do is transgress against that, remove the blinders and see the whole in panoramic vision. Sometimes it's to the detriment of survival because you're not paying attention sometimes to what you need to. But artists throughout ages, have proven that what they have done, because they see more and they are willing to take that risk to transgress beyond what they have created, right, has become something that is enduring and something that is invaluable to our experience many, many years later. So Vincent van Gogh, Emily Dickinson, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, all these people, in a sense, pushed against the normative conventionalities of their days and created a form that speaks into their reality, but at the same time, that act of love has given us this gift that we are able to see through and learn from and grow from, because these masterpieces allow us to live in our present, to see our time better, to ask questions that perhaps we have failed to focus on because we are so divided and we're so focused on this limited perspective.
Talking to Makoto Fujimura here in his beautiful gallery in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Thank you, Mako, for having us. It's been a wonderful, lovely conversation. Thank you.
So great to have this. Thank you.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with abstract expressionist painter Makoto Fujimura. Mako is a former presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts. He's been recognized for his contributions to bridging art and faith, and he's the founder of I Am Culture Care, and is the author of several books, including Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Emily Seiner, Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.